Imagine standing on a narrow strip of land, barely wide enough for a dozen men to stand shoulder to shoulder. Waves crash against rocks on one side. A sheer cliff rises on the other. And ahead of you stretches a wall of Persian soldiers so vast it darkens the horizon like a coming storm. You have 300 men. The enemy has hundreds of thousands. And you already know with absolute certainty that you are not going home. Thermopylae is remembered as the greatest military last stand in human history. A moment where flesh, bronze, and sheer willpower held back the destruction of an entire civilization. But here's the problem with legends: they only show you the final chapter, the blood-soaked climax, where heroes die nobly for freedom. They never show you the darkness that created the man standing at the front of that line. Leonidas was not some noble warrior born with courage flowing naturally through his veins. He was not the composed, philosophical King Hollywood sold you in slow-motion combat sequences set to epic music. He was manufactured, forged inside a society so terrified of its own enslaved population that it turned child-rearing into a form of systematic warfare. Before we dive into the battle that changed Western civilization, smash that like button and subscribe to Maproom Battles for the stories that actually decided history. Comment, where are you watching from? Right now, Sparta was nothing like Athens. There were no great philosophical debates in marble academies, no poets sipping wine under olive trees, no celebration of individual thought or artistic beauty. Sparta was a militarized fortress carved into the rocky hills of Laconia, where a small class of so-called equals, the homoioi, ruled over a massive population of enslaved people known as the helots. These slaves outnumbered their masters by staggering margins, in some regions 10-1, in others even higher. And every single day, the Spartans lived with one suffocating truth that shaped every decision, every law, every child raised within their walls. If the helots ever united and rose together, Sparta would cease to exist overnight. So they built a system specifically designed to produce killers. The Agoj boys were ripped from their families at 7 years old and thrown into over a decade of organized, calculated suffering. Starvation was official policy, not an accident. Violence was the curriculum, not a punishment. Emotional attachment was a defect to be systematically eliminated. No warmth, no softness, no individual thought, only the group, only the mission, only survival at any cost. And around 540 BC, a boy who had no expectation of ever becoming king was fed into that machine. A third-born son of royalty with no throne waiting for him. No special privileges to shield him from what was coming. His name was Leonidas. What emerged on the other side 15 years later was not a man built for peace or negotiation or compromise. It was someone who had endured watching his own brothers spiral into ruin, who had survived years of calculated brutality, freezing nights with no shelter, days with no food, and the ever-present awareness that Sparta was a powder keg sitting on top of a lit fuse. So when Xerxes, the self-proclaimed king of kings, began assembling the largest invasion force the ancient world had ever seen to avenge Persia's humiliation at Marathon, Leonidas was exactly the kind of weapon Sparta needed. And when a corrupted oracle delivered a prophecy that either Sparta itself would be reduced to ashes or a Spartan king must fall in battle, Leonidas received that message the way he had been trained to receive everything in his life as an order. No hesitation, no negotiation. no room for doubt. Thermopylae was never an accident. It was the inevitable conclusion of a life built on discipline, paranoia, and sacrifice, a life that had systematically stripped away everything human except the capacity to obey and the willingness to die. Long before Persia ever cast its shadow westward toward Greece, Sparta was already at war. But the enemy wasn't some distant kingdom across the sea sending armies and fleets. The enemy was underneath them, literally beneath their feet, working their fields, harvesting their grain, carrying their water. A tiny class of full citizens, the homoioi, sat on top of a massive population of helots, enslaved laborers, bound to the soil of Laconia and Messenia, forbidden to leave, forbidden to own property, forbidden to have any existence beyond serving their masters. In some areas, these captive workers outnumbered their Spartan overlords by margins that would have terrified any rational government. Every meal the Spartans ate, every grain stored in their warehouses, every piece of clothing on their backs came from helot hands. And every single morning, the Spartans woke up knowing that if those same hands ever picked up weapons and rose together in coordinated revolt, the entire Spartan world would be gone before the sun set that evening. So Sparta chose fear as its primary tool of government. And nothing demonstrated that brutal philosophy more clearly than the Crypteia. On the surface, ancient sources described it as a kind of secret police force designed to maintain order. In practice, it was a death squad, run by teenagers, barely old enough to grow beards. Young Spartans who had survived the worst of the Agoge were handed knives and minimal supplies, sent out into the countryside under cover of darkness, and given one simple job hunt. But they weren't hunting foreign soldiers or wild animals. They were hunting helots, their own enslaved population. Any helot who looked too strong, too confident, too capable of leadership, too likely to organize resistance, these were the targets. The Crypteia killed at night without warning, without trial, without any pretense of justice. It was designed to keep an entire population too terrified to even think about resistance, to make collaboration impossible, because tomorrow your neighbor might be found with his throat cut in a ditch. And it doubled as training for Sparta's future warriors. Those boys learned to move silently through hostile territory, to kill without hesitation or remorse, to carry the weight of blood on their hands before they ever stepped onto an actual battlefield facing foreign enemies. This was the world waiting for a boy named Leonidas around 540 BC. He was not the son of some anonymous soldier or minor noble. He was born into the Agia dynasty, one of Sparta's two royal houses that had ruled for generations. Sparta had a governmental system unlike any other Greek state. Two kings ruled simultaneously, each from a different bloodline, designed to keep one another in check so that no single man could seize absolute power and turn the state into a personal dictatorship. In theory, it was a clever safeguard against tyranny. In reality, it was a machine that generated constant rivalry, suspicion, and political tension. And in Sparta, royal blood did not mean luxury or protection from hardship. It meant scrutiny from birth. It meant expectations that could crush a child. It meant being watched every single day of your life by elders who were looking for any sign of weakness. Leonidas's father, King Anaxandridas II, fathered several sons. The eldest was Cleomenes, the heir to the Aegead throne, because Cleomenes was destined by birth order to become king. Spartan tradition shielded him from the full brutality of the agoge training system. The reasoning was practical and ruthless at the same time. You don't risk shattering the boy who will one day lead your army and represent your dynasty. So Cleomenes was raised with what passed for a lighter hand, in Sparta still hard by any normal standard, still disciplined and demanding, but spared from the absolute worst of what the agoge could do to a human mind and body. Then came Dorieus, the second son. No such protection existed for him. He was thrown into the system with everyone else, common boys, sons of lesser nobles, anyone who expected to become a full Spartan citizen. He trained alongside them, bled alongside them, starved alongside them, froze alongside them, and endured every punishment designed to strip a boy down to nothing and rebuild him as a weapon. He came out the other side fierce, proud, hardened, and filled with contempt for an older brother who had never truly earned what he was about to inherit simply by accident of birth. And then there was Leonidas, the third son, the one nobody had planned for, the spare of the spare. Under normal circumstances, he would have spent his life as a soldier, maybe rising to become a respected commander if he proved himself capable, but never a king. That status sealed everything about his childhood. At the age of 7, exactly like every other boy whose family expected him to become a full Spartan citizen, he was taken from his home and delivered to the agoge. His mother could not keep him. His royal name could not protect him. The Spartan state swallowed him whole. The agoge was not a school in any sense we would recognize. It was not a training camp designed to teach useful skills and build character. It was a years-long experiment in controlled suffering. A deliberate process of breaking children down psychologically and physically to see what could be rebuilt from the fragments. Boys were divided into packs called agalae and housed in communal barracks. Each year, they received one cloak, a single piece of rough fabric. That was their only clothing through blistering summers and freezing winters. No shoes, no beds with mattresses or blankets. They slept on mats they had to weave themselves from reeds gathered at the riverside. And if they didn't gather enough reeds, if they were lazy or slow, they slept on bare ground in the cold. That wasn't a failure of the system, that was the system working exactly as Sparta intended. Food was deliberately kept scarce. The boys were given just enough rations to survive, but never enough to feel full, never enough to stop the constant gnawing hunger in their stomachs. They were expected to steal the rest bread from markets, cheese from storehouses, scraps of meat from anywhere they could find them. If they succeeded without being caught, they ate. If they were discovered in the act, they were beaten savagely with whips and fists. Not because theft was considered morally wrong, Spartans actually admired cunning and resourcefulness. They were beaten because getting caught was considered weak, incompetent, a failure of skill. The lesson, buried inside every empty stomach and every bruised rib, was brutally simple. You will learn to take what you need to survive. You will learn to do it invisibly, without leaving traces. And you will never, ever complain about hunger or hardship. Older boys held absolute authority over younger ones. That meant relentless bullying, physical assaults disguised as discipline, psychological domination presented as necessary toughening. The whip was not a punishment reserved for serious offenses, it was part of daily life, woven into the fabric of training. Public flogging competitions were held at religious shrines, where boys were beaten systematically until they collapsed or passed out from pain, all while adult citizens stood around watching approvingly, judging which boys endured longest without crying out. The entire point was to make pain irrelevant, to divorce physical suffering from emotional response. Crying was shameful. Flinching was a disgrace that marked you as soft. A true Spartan was expected to absorb anything: broken bones, torn flesh, starvation, freezing cold, in total silence, with a blank face. And in the middle of all this brutal machinery stood Leonidas. Picture a boy who knows he carries royal blood in his veins, but receives absolutely no special treatment whatsoever because of it. No softer bed, no extra food ration, no reprieve from the beatings or the cold nights. He is kicked awake before dawn by older boys who enjoy their power. He is ordered to run until his lungs burn and his legs shake. He is forced to fight, to wrestle in the dirt, to obey commands without question or hesitation. Many boys shattered completely under the pressure. Some physically, their bodies gave out. They died from disease, or exposure, or injuries that weren't treated properly. Some mentally, they became hollow, obedient shells capable of following orders, but incapable of independent thought, broken inside in ways that never healed. The fragments of ancient sources that survive suggest Leonidas did not break that way. He adapted instead. Where other boys saw only cruelty and suffering without purpose, he saw a series of tests to be passed, obstacles to be overcome. Every scar, every bruise, every night spent shivering with an empty stomach, gnawing at his insides, became fuel rather than despair. He learned how to move without making sound, how to steal without leaving evidence, how to fight as part of a coordinated unit rather than as an individual, how to take orders without resentment festering inside, and eventually how to command others with the same cold efficiency that had been used on him. And from all those years of enforced silence and systematic suffering, he developed one quality that Sparta prized above almost everything else: laconism. Laconism was not just a habit of speaking briefly to save time. It was a philosophy weaponized into everyday conversation. Spartans trained themselves to use as few words as possible in every situation. Long explanations were viewed as weakness, as evidence you couldn't think clearly. Emotional outbursts were complete failure. Excuses were beneath contempt, unworthy of a citizen. A true Spartan opened his mouth only when his words could hit harder and more precisely than a spear thrust. Leonidas absorbed this approach completely. He became the kind of man who could sit through an hour of heated debate among politicians and generals, listen to every argument, every plea, every threat, and then demolish all of it with a single sentence delivered in a flat, emotionless voice. As Leonidas moved through the final brutal stages of the agoge and transitioned into full adulthood and military service, the political landscape above him was shifting in dangerous ways. His father aged. The question of royal succession stopped being an abstract future concern and became urgent and immediate. Around 520 BC, Anaxandridas died. Cleomenes, the eldest son who had been shielded from the worst of the agoge, ascended to the throne as Cleomenes, and on that day, The fundamental crack in Sparta's dual-king system was exposed for everyone to see. The most powerful man in the state had never fully endured the one process that defined what it meant to be Spartan. Cleomenes was intelligent, there's no question about that. He could be brilliant in diplomacy, devastating in war when he focused his energy properly. But he was also erratic, impulsive, and increasingly unstable as the years passed. Herodotus, writing within living memory of these events, records episode after episode of a king who swung wildly between moments of genius and moments of reckless, self-destructive behavior. He launched military operations without proper authorization from the ephors, the 5 elected magistrates powerful enough to challenge even the kings. He meddled constantly in the internal politics of other Greek cities, sometimes achieving remarkable results that strengthened Sparta's position, and sometimes leaving wreckage and burned relationships behind. Rumors circulated widely that he had bribed the oracle at Delphi, the most sacred religious authority in all of Greece, to help him remove Demaratus, the other Spartan king from the rival Eurypontid dynasty, from power. Whether that specific accusation was literally true or fabricated by his enemies doesn't change the underlying pattern. Cleomenes believed the rules existed for other people, not for him. Dorius watched all of this unfold with growing, consuming rage. He had bled through every stage of the agoge. He had done everything the Spartan system demanded, without complaint or special treatment. In his own mind, he was the real Spartan, the one who had earned the right to lead through suffering and discipline. Yet he was forced to kneel before a brother he considered soft, privileged, and fundamentally undeserving of the crown he wore. That bitterness became unbearable. And so Dorius chose the path that Spartans despised most of all. He left. He gathered a band of loyal followers and sailed away from Sparta, determined to carve out his own kingdom somewhere, anywhere he could escape his brother's shadow and prove to the world that he was born to rule. First, he attempted to establish a colony in Libya. When that venture failed and collapsed, he turned his ambitions towards Sicily, searching desperately for unclaimed land where he could build something worthy of his pride. But Sicily was already claimed by powers far stronger than a band of exiled Spartans. Carthaginian influence and military strength extended across much of the island. Dorius marched straight into the jaws of an established empire with nothing but his own skill and fury. According to Herodotus, he and nearly all his men were destroyed in battle against Carthaginian forces. The warrior who could not stomach living under a brother he despised died far from home, chasing a throne that never existed, his body left on foreign soil without proper burial. Leonidas stayed. He did not flee to Libya or Sicily seeking glory elsewhere. He did not plot a coup or gather secret supporters. He watched, and he learned. He watched how a king could damage Sparta from the inside through erratic decisions and personal instability. He watched how pride and impatience had led Dorius to a meaningless death on a battlefield thousands of miles from anything that mattered. The third son, the one no one had ever planned for, was quietly absorbing lessons about power, patience, and survival that no stage of the agoge could have taught him. During these years, he almost certainly served in Spartan military operations, border patrols along Laconia's frontiers, campaigns against neighboring city-states, and the ongoing brutal suppression of Helot unrest that never truly stopped. His life was not peaceful or comfortable, but it was deliberate and purposeful. He remained inside the system that had built him, waiting without complaint. Then Cleomenes spiraled beyond anyone's ability to ignore or excuse. His behavior became increasingly extreme and disconnected from reality. He drove away diplomatic allies Sparta desperately needed. His violence stopped serving any strategic purpose and became random, chaotic, directed at targets that made no sense. He allegedly attacked a group of Argive refugees seeking sanctuary in a sacred grove and burned them alive, a violation of the most basic religious laws that governed Greek warfare. The ephors, the 5 elected magistrates powerful enough to challenge even the kings when necessary, began to view him as a direct threat to Sparta's stability and survival. Eventually, they made their decision. They declared him officially insane. For a Spartan king to be formally labeled mad by his own government was the end of everything, of authority, of dignity, of life as he had known it. Cleomenes was seized by force, placed in chains, and imprisoned like a dangerous animal. The man who had inherited the throne without ever facing the full weight of the agoge now found himself stripped of all power, restrained and humiliated in front of the very people he once commanded. What happened next remains one of the most disturbing and contested moments in Spartan history. The official account, preserved by Herodotus, says that Cleomenes somehow persuaded a guard to give him a blade, a knife, or short sword. Then, alone in his cell, he methodically cut himself apart, slicing his own flesh from his shins upward across his thighs, hips, and stomach until he bled to death in agony. It's a picture of absolute horror and total madness, the final act of a mind completely destroyed. But many modern historians believe the story was a carefully constructed cover, a convenient narrative designed to hide what actually happened. A king that unstable, that dangerous to Sparta's reputation and political relationships, that capable of dragging the entire state into catastrophe through unpredictable actions. Such a man might not have been left alone with a sharp weapon by accident. It's entirely plausible, perhaps even likely, that the same system that once elevated Cleomenes to the throne quietly decided to remove him permanently when he became too great a liability. Whatever the real truth buried beneath official accounts, the outcome was final and irreversible. The first son was dead in disgrace. The second son was long dead on a Sicilian battlefield, his ambitions turned to dust. And that left exactly one man standing. Around 490 BC, Leonidas, the quiet survivor, the third son, the product of every brutal lesson Sparta had ever designed, became king. He did not win the throne through political ambition or military conspiracy. He did not seize it through violence or manipulation. He simply outlasted everyone who stood ahead of him in line, surviving through patience and discipline while his brothers destroyed themselves. And his timing could not have been more dangerous or consequential. That same year, 490 BC, the Persian king Darius I launched a military expedition across the Aegean Sea to punish Athens and its allies for supporting a revolt among the Ionian Greek cities under Persian control. The Persians landed at Marathon, a coastal plain northeast of Athens. The Athenians, reinforced by a small contingent from the city of Plataea, made a decision that should have been suicide. They charged directly at the Persian lines. And somehow, against all rational expectation, they shattered them. Persian infantry broke and fled to their ships. It was a victory that should have been impossible given the forces involved. Instead, it became the most celebrated military triumph in Athenian history. Proof that Persian power, seemingly infinite and unstoppable, could actually be broken by disciplined Greek hoplites fighting in formation. For Athens, Marathon was validation, glory, a moment that would be remembered and retold for generations. For Persia, it was an unforgivable humiliation, a wound to imperial pride that could not be allowed to stand. Darius swore revenge, began planning a second, larger invasion, but death claimed him in 486 BC before he could assemble his forces and cross the Aegean again. His son Xerxes inherited a throne that stretched from the Indus River to the shores of the Aegean, along with his father's unfinished rage and burning desire for vengeance. For Xerxes, Marathon was not merely a tactical defeat to be avenged. It was a personal insult to the empire itself, to the very concept of Persian dominance. Over the following years, he began assembling something the ancient world had never witnessed, a military force of truly staggering scale, combining contingents from dozens of subject nations, aimed directly at the heart of Greece, with the explicit goal of erasing Greek independence forever. While Xerxes stockpiled ships, conscripted soldiers from every corner of his vast empire, built bridges across entire seas, and prepared the logistics for moving hundreds of thousands of men westward, Leonidas governed Sparta in a manner completely unlike his erratic predecessor. He was steady, measured, cautious where caution made sense. He followed Spartan laws rather than trying to bend or break them for personal advantage. He cooperated with the ephors instead of viewing them as obstacles to be outmaneuvered. His training in the agoge, that brutal childhood that had taught him to suppress individual desires and serve the collective, had made him both cautious and decisive, a rare and valuable combination. Sparta did not need another gambler or visionary prone to brilliant mistakes. It needed a king who would not lose his nerve when faced with impossible odds, who would make the hard decisions without flinching. And Leonidas was not operating alone. Spartan women received an education and enjoyed freedoms almost unheard of anywhere else in the ancient Greek world. They were expected to be physically strong, intellectually sharp, capable of managing estates and making decisions while their husbands were away at war. They were trained to speak their minds directly, to challenge men when necessary, to prioritize the state's needs above personal feelings. Leonidas's wife, Gorgo, was legendary even during her own lifetime for her intelligence, her sharp perception, and her ability to see through deception. One story preserved by Herodotus demonstrates exactly how critical she was to Sparta's survival in these years. A Spartan exile living in the Persian court, almost certainly the deposed king Demaratus, removed from power through Cleomenes' political scheming, needed desperately to warn Sparta that Xerxes was preparing a massive invasion. But sending such a message openly was absolute suicide. If Persian agents intercepted it, if anyone suspected what he was doing, Demaratus would be executed immediately and horribly. So he devised an ingenious method. He took a writing tablet, scraped off all the wax surface used for writing, and carved his warning directly into the bare wood underneath. Then, he carefully recoated the surface with fresh wax so that the tablet appeared completely blank, empty, worthless. When the tablet arrived in Sparta, carried by a trusted courier, the officials who examined it were completely baffled. There was no visible message, no writing, nothing. They suspected it might be a trick, a distraction, or perhaps just a meaningless gesture from an exile desperate for attention. They were ready to dismiss it entirely. It was Gorgo who solved the puzzle. She told them calmly to remove the wax coating. Beneath it, scratched carefully into the wood in tiny letters, were the words that changed everything. Xerxes is coming with the full force of the Persian Empire. That warning reached Leonidas and the Spartan government because one woman refused to accept that something was truly empty just because it looked that way on the surface. As Xerxes' preparations grew too massive to conceal fleets gathering, armies assembling, roads being improved to handle the movement of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, he shifted from covert buildup to open intimidation. Persian ambassadors fanned out across the Greek world carrying a single, simple demand delivered to every independent city-state, earth, and water. These were the ancient symbols of total submission, surrender of sovereignty itself. Offering earth meant your land now belonged to Persia. Offering water meant your lives, your resources. Everything you possessed existed only at the pleasure of the King of Kings. Many Greek cities, faced with that choice, surrendered immediately. Thessaly submitted almost without resistance. Cities across Boeotia bent the knee. Argos, one of the most powerful states in the Peloponnese, chose survival over resistance, opposing the Persian Empire, the largest, most powerful military force the world had ever seen, seemed like pure madness, a guaranteed path to destruction. Why sacrifice your city, your population, your entire future for an abstract idea like freedom when you could kneel, pay tribute, and continue to breathe and exist under the protection of an empire that ruled from India to Egypt? When the Persian ambassadors arrived in Sparta and presented themselves before the government, they repeated the same demand that had worked across dozens of Greek cities, earth and water. Submit to Xerxes. Acknowledge Persian supremacy. Sparta will be allowed to continue existing as a tributary state. On the surface, it was a straightforward choice between practical survival and suicidal pride. Submit and live, or refuse and face certain annihilation. But Leonidas and the Spartan authorities understood something deeper that went beyond immediate survival. There were customs even in war, rules that civilized peoples were expected to follow. Killing envoys, murdering ambassadors who came under diplomatic protection, was considered an act of barbarism that crossed a sacred line recognized across the entire ancient world. Messengers were supposed to be untouchable, immune from violence, the last fragile thread connecting two sides before war consumed everything. Sparta severed that thread with spectacular, calculated brutality. The story preserved in ancient sources tells us that the Persian envoys were brought before the Spartan authorities and made their demand formally. The Spartans listened in silence. Then they told the ambassadors calmly that if Xerxes wanted earth and water from Sparta, his representatives were welcome to collect it themselves. They pointed to a deep well. "You will find all the earth and water you need at the bottom," they said, and then they grabbed the Persian ambassadors and threw them down the well to their deaths. That was not simply a refusal of Persian demands. It was a deliberate, Irreversible provocation, designed specifically to humiliate Xerxes and make diplomatic resolution completely impossible. Sparta had not just rejected the King of Kings, it had murdered his personal representatives in a way calculated to demonstrate total contempt for Persian power. There was no diplomatic path left after that moment, no room for negotiation or compromise. War was now an absolute certainty, and everyone involved understood that. The shock wave traveled across Greece like an earthquake. Every city-state, every government, every leader understood immediately what Sparta had done and what it meant by killing those envoys in such a public, brutal manner. Sparta had guaranteed that Xerxes would come with everything he had, that this would not be a limited punitive expedition, but a full invasion designed to erase Sparta from existence. Fear spread like a disease through the Greek world. If the Persian army arrived at full strength and the Greek cities remained divided, bickering among themselves as they had for generations, every last one of them would be crushed individually, picked off one by one like sheep scattered before wolves. Athens, Corinth, Thebes, and representatives from other cities gathered in desperate emergency councils. They argued, shouted, accused each other of cowardice and betrayal, and panicked. But underneath all the noise and recrimination was one unavoidable military reality that everyone had to face. Only one Greek state possessed a land army capable of standing toe-to-toe with Persian heavy infantry on open ground and surviving the collision. Sparta. The Themistocles of Athens, one of the sharpest political and military minds in Greek history, a man who understood both strategy and human psychology, proposed a defensive plan. Greece would not attempt to fight Persia across every front simultaneously, spreading forces too thin to hold anywhere. Instead, the Greeks would choose specific choke points, narrow places where terrain worked in their favor, and force the enormous Persian army into confined spaces where its overwhelming numerical superiority became a disadvantage rather than an asset. At sea, the Greek fleet, built primarily around Athenian warships, fast triremes with bronze rams, would engage the Persian navy in narrow straits, where maneuverability mattered more than raw numbers. On land, the massive Persian ground force would need to be held at a bottleneck so tight that only a fraction of its soldiers could fight at any given moment, negating Persia's ability to simply overwhelm defenders through sheer mass. Every map, every scout report, every geographic analysis pointed to one location above all others as the ideal defensive position, Thermopylae. The hot gates, named for the thermal springs that bubbled up from the ground nearby, a narrow coastal pass squeezed between steep, unclimbable mountain cliffs on one side and the sea on the other, running along the northern shore of central Greece. At its tightest points, the pass was barely wide enough for a handful of men to stand abreast. If disciplined, heavily armored Greek hoplites locked their shields together in that gap and held formation. The Persian army, no matter how vast, would be forced to feed soldiers into the killing zone in small numbers, negating their greatest tactical advantage. The strategy was elegant in its brutal simplicity. Hold the pass long enough for the Greek fleet to win a decisive naval engagement somewhere nearby. If the fleet succeeded in destroying or crippling Persian naval power, Xerxes' supply lines across the Aegean would be severed. The enormous land army, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, would then be stranded deep in hostile Greek territory with no reliable way to feed itself or bring in reinforcements. Leonidas understood the military logic immediately. He also understood the terrible risk embedded in the plan. If Thermopylae fell too quickly, before the fleet could achieve anything decisive, nothing would stop the Persian army from pouring south into central Greece. Athens would burn. The cities of the Peloponnese would be exposed. Greek independence would be finished. He agreed to lead the defensive force north to Thermopylae. To do that job properly, to hold a pass against an empire, he needed the full strength of Sparta's professional standing army, the elite core of citizens who had survived the Agoge, men who could hold any defensive line through discipline and skill. He went to the ephors and formally requested permission to mobilize the army for immediate deployment. And he hit a wall harder than any Persian shield. The timing of the proposed march north coincided exactly with the Carneia, one of Sparta's most sacred religious festivals dedicated to Apollo. Spartan law ancient, inflexible law that had governed the state for generations, strictly prohibited launching major military campaigns during the festival period. The gods came first, always. Religious obligations took precedence over everything, even survival. Violating that rule was not merely illegal or politically dangerous, it was considered an invitation for divine punishment that would curse the entire state. The same religious restriction had nearly prevented Sparta from sending help to Athens before the Battle of Marathon years earlier, and the Athenians had never forgotten or forgiven that delay. Now, with an existential threat bearing down on all of Greece, Sparta's own laws had frozen its military capability in place. The ephors refused Leonidas's request. The army would stay home and observe the festival properly. Wait until the religious obligations were fulfilled, then march north. On one side of the equation, sacred duty to the gods, laws that had governed Sparta for centuries. On the other side, the survival of everything they had built, everything they were. It was a contradiction that could have paralyzed them completely, destroyed any chance of meaningful resistance. But Leonidas was a product of the Agage, trained from childhood to find solutions rather than making excuses. He did not waste energy fighting immovable obstacles or arguing with religious law. He looked for a way around the restriction that would satisfy both requirements. The law prohibited mobilizing the full Spartan army during the Carneia. It said nothing specific about the king traveling north with his personal bodyguard on what could be framed as an advance reconnaissance mission. Sparta maintained an elite royal guard, exactly 300 warriors, hand-picked from the absolute finest soldiers in a state that produced nothing but professional warriors. These were not ordinary citizens. These were men who had distinguished themselves in previous campaigns, proven their courage and skill beyond any doubt, earned their positions through demonstrated excellence. Leonidas went back to the ephors with a different proposal, carefully designed to satisfy the letter of the law. He would not mobilize the full Spartan army in violation of religious restrictions. He would simply take his personal guard of 300 north as an advance force, a preliminary deployment to scout the position and begin preparations. Technically, it was not a full military campaign, just the king moving with his authorized bodyguard. The ephors, trapped by their own legal framework and terrified of appearing completely passive while Greece prepared for invasion, approved the modified request. Perhaps some of them told themselves that reinforcements would follow once the Carneia festival ended in a few weeks. Perhaps they believed Leonidas was buying time until the main army could march. Leonidas almost certainly knew the truth. No reinforcements would arrive in time to matter. The festival would end, but by then, the battle would already be decided one way or another. He was marching north with 300 men to face hundreds of thousands, and everyone involved understood on some level what that meant. He added one final requirement to the selection process, a detail that reveals with devastating clarity exactly what he expected from this mission. Only men who already had living sons were eligible to join the 300. On the surface, it sounds like a cold administrative detail, a bureaucratic checkbox. Beneath the surface, it is absolutely devastating in its implications. Leonidas did not believe these men were coming home alive. He wanted to guarantee that every bloodline represented in that force would continue even after the men themselves were dead. That Sparta would not lose entire families when the fighting was over. This was not a heroic charge designed to win a surprising victory through superior tactics. This was a calculated sacrifice, planned and accepted from the very beginning. Spartan farewells carried no softness, no tears, no emotional displays that might be interpreted as weakness. Mothers and wives did not collapse weeping, begging their men to stay home safely. Women in Sparta were raised from childhood to view cowardice as a fate genuinely worse than death itself, as a stain on family honor that could never be washed away. There is a famous instruction passed down through generations, spoken when a Spartan woman placed a heavy bronze shield into a departing warrior's hands. With it, or on it, come back carrying your shield in victory, or be carried home dead upon it as a stretcher. If you dropped your shield on the battlefield to run faster and retreat, you had abandoned your honor and your place among your people. The last recorded exchange between Gorgo and Leonidas fits this culture with painful precision. She did not ask him why he had to go, did not beg him to find another solution. She asked simply, practically, "What should I do after you are gone?" His answer was brief, stripped of all sentimentality, delivered as a final order: marry a good man, have good children. It was not a love letter. It was not a romantic farewell. It was a commander's instruction to ensure Sparta's future. If he fell, if he never returned, the state still needed strong citizens, healthy children, continuation of the bloodline and the system. His personal feelings were completely irrelevant to that necessity. The 300 assembled in their distinctive crimson cloaks, carrying their heavy bronze-faced shields and long ash-wood spears. Other Greek allied contingents agreed to join them as they moved north, soldiers from various cities who understood the stakes, who knew this might be the last chance to stop Persia before it swallowed Greece entirely. But before Leonidas marched to the place where he fully expected to die, he stopped at Delphi, the most revered religious sanctuary in all of Greece. The place where the god Apollo spoke through his priestess to guide human affairs. The Pythia, the priestess who served as Apollo's voice, delivered a prophecy that confirmed what Leonidas already felt in his bones, what he had known since the moment he agreed to this mission. Her words, recorded by Herodotus and preserved across centuries, left absolutely no room for hope or alternative interpretation. Either Sparta itself would be destroyed completely by the barbarian invaders, reduced to ashes and memory, or one of its kings descended from the hero Heracles would fall in battle. The choice was binary and absolute. The city could be saved only by the death of a king. No clever strategy could change it. No tactical brilliance would substitute. Blood for survival, a royal life for a civilization's continuation. For most men, receiving that prophecy would have been like hearing a death sentence spoken out loud by the gods themselves. For Leonidas, shaped by decades of obedience to forces larger than himself, trained to accept orders without question, it was almost clarifying in its brutal simplicity. The uncertainty was gone. His death was not just a high probability or a likely outcome, it was a cosmic requirement, written into the fabric of fate itself. Thermopylae stopped being merely a dangerous military assignment and became something closer to a ritual offering, a sacrifice demanded by powers beyond human control. He was walking toward the altar, and he knew it with absolute certainty. He marched north without hesitation. As the various Greek allied forces gathered near the pass over the following days, the gap between what had been promised in the emergency councils and what actually arrived became painfully, dangerously obvious. In theory, based on the discussions and commitments made by representatives from various cities, a large coalition army was supposed to assemble at Thermopylae. Spartans, other Peloponnesian contingents, Phocians who knew the local terrain, Locrians, soldiers from cities across Greece, combining their strength. In practice, fear and political hesitation crippled the response. Some cities sent token forces instead of their full military strength, just enough to claim they had participated without actually risking significant casualties. Others delayed endlessly, found excuses, waited to see which way the wind would blow. When Leonidas finally tallied his allied forces at Thermopylae, he had roughly 7,000 men total, including his own 300 Spartans. It was nowhere near enough to hold against the army that was coming, but it was all he had, and it would have to be enough. They reached Thermopylae and surveyed the terrain. It matched the strategic analysis perfectly. Steep mountain cliffs rising sharply on the inland side, too steep to climb in armor while carrying weapons. The sea pressing in close on the coastal side, leaving only a narrow corridor between. At the narrowest sections of the pass, the gap was barely wide enough for a dozen men to stand shoulder to shoulder. The remnants of an old defensive wall, originally constructed decades earlier by local Phocians during some forgotten conflict, still stood in partial ruin across the pass. Leonidas immediately ordered it, rebuilt, and reinforced with fresh stone and timber. That low barrier, backed by rows of armored hoplites, standing in tight formation with locked shields, would transform the narrow pass into a killing corridor. Scouts pushed forward cautiously to get a look at what was approaching from the north, and they came back shaken to their very core by what they had seen. What they described was not an army in any conventional sense, not just soldiers marching in formation. It was a migrating empire, an entire civilization on the move. Warriors from every corner of Xerxes' vast domain: Medes, Persians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, soldiers drawn from the distant edges of Asia, cavalry units, massive formations of archers, endless columns of heavy infantry, supply trains stretching beyond the horizon as far as eyes could see. Behind the combat troops, servants, engineers, administrators, camp followers, thousands of non-combatants necessary to sustain an army of this scale. The dust cloud they raised as they marched was so vast it literally blotted out sections of the sky. Herodotus, writing his account a generation later, claimed the Persian force numbered in the millions, over 2 million soldiers plus support personnel. Modern scholars, analyzing logistics and the physical capacity of the region to support such numbers. Estimate the actual force was more likely somewhere between 200,000 and 300,000 fighting men. But standing on that coastal road, staring into the approaching haze of dust, and hearing the distant rumble of hundreds of thousands of feet, the precise number was completely meaningless. It was simply more human beings in one place, moving with one purpose, than anyone present had ever seen or imagined possible. The Persian host finally materialized at the far northern end of the pass, a dark mass filling the landscape. When Xerxes himself arrived several days later, seated in his ornate royal pavilion carried by servants, and surveyed the Greek position blocking his path south, what he saw must have both baffled and infuriated him. The Spartans were not panicking. They were not scrambling desperately to reinforce their flimsy wall. They were not sending messengers begging for mercy. According to the accounts that survived through Herodotus, some of them were calmly grooming their long hair. Spartans famously wore their hair long as a mark of citizenship and stretching their muscles, limbering up, preparing for combat with the same casual, methodical discipline they would bring to an athletic competition at a festival. Xerxes waited. Surely, he must have thought, once these Greeks fully grasped the scale of what was bearing down on them, once they saw the full extent of the Persian army assembling, camp spreading for miles, supply trains arriving, they would break psychologically and scatter into the mountains. Days passed. The Greeks did not move. They reinforced their wall. They drilled. They waited. Finally, Xerxes sent a herald forward under flag of truce with an offer. A final chance at survival. Surrender your weapons now. Submit to Persian authority. You will be allowed to live. Xerxes is merciful to those who bend the knee. It was a generous offer by the standards of ancient warfare, delivered with the full crushing weight of the largest military force ever assembled, sitting directly behind it. Leonidas, the man who had spent his entire life learning to say only what was absolutely necessary, who had been trained to strip away everything except essential meaning, delivered the response that would ring through every century that followed, that would be remembered and repeated when everything else about this battle had faded into myth. 2 words in Greek, molon labe. Come and take them. No further discussion. No negotiation. No counteroffer. No retreat. The line had been drawn in the dust and stones of Thermopylae, and it would not move. Xerxes had his answer. He had stared across the narrow pass, measured the small force blocking his path to southern Greece, and extended what he considered a reasonable offer of mercy. Leonidas had thrown it back in his face with contempt. The King of Kings turned to his generals and issued the command that would begin 3 days of slaughter, no more patience. No more diplomacy. No more waiting for these Greeks to see reason. Send the first wave forward and sweep them aside. The mountain corridor was about to become a slaughterhouse, and 300 Spartans were standing directly in the center of it, exactly where they had chosen to be. The first troops Xerxes fed into the pass were expendable soldiers he could afford to lose without weakening his core forces. Medes and Sicyon, warriors drawn from conquered provinces, shoved forward by officers to test the Greek defenses and probe for weaknesses. Their orders were brutally simple: march forward into the pass. Overwhelm the wall through sheer numbers. Sweep the defenders aside and open the road. with the massive weight of the Persian army behind them, with hundreds of thousands more soldiers waiting to pour through once the gap opened. No one on the Persian side expected this to be difficult or costly. They advanced in dense columns, officers driving them forward with whips and shouted commands. Shields raised, voices roaring, war cries meant to intimidate. Then they collided with the phalanx, and everything changed. The pass was suffocatingly narrow, only wide enough at that point for perhaps a dozen men to stand abreast. The Spartans and their Greek allies stood locked together in the ancient fighting formation that had dominated Mediterranean warfare for generations. Each man carried a heavy round shield, called a hoplon, faced with bronze, roughly a meter across. A long spear, the dory approximately 2.5 meters of ash wood, tipped with iron, and a short iron sword, the scyphos, on his hip as a backup weapon. Bronze helmets encase their skulls, with narrow eye slits and cheek guards. Bronze cuirasses covered their chests. Bronze greaves protected their shins. They were not a loose crowd of individual fighters. They were a machine, drilled and coordinated. Every man's survival dependent on the man beside him holding position. And when the Medes crashed into them at a run, it was like charging headfirst into a moving wall made of metal, wood, and muscle that had no intention of giving ground. The front rank of Greek hoplites pressed their shields together into a seamless barrier with no gaps. Behind them, the second and third ranks thrust their long spears forward, over the shoulders and between the shields of the men ahead. From the Persian perspective, rushing forward with lighter wicker shields and leather armor, it must have looked like a single massive slab of bronze, sprouting a deadly forest of razor-tipped iron points. Their own shields, woven from wicker and covered with hide, were nearly worthless against the Greek spear thrusts. The Greek spears punched through wicker, through leather, into faces and throats and chests before the attackers could get close enough to use their own shorter weapons effectively. Leonidas was not commanding from some safe position behind the lines, shouting orders from a distance. He was in the front rank, exactly where Spartan tradition and training demanded. A king must be crushed into the grinding press of bodies, drenched in sweat and other men's blood, bronze armor dented and scraped, barking short commands in that clipped laconic style, setting the brutal tempo of the killing. When the Persians stalled in their advance, when the front rows of attackers began to buckle and waver under the pressure of shields and spears, when the momentum of the charge died, he gave the order every Spartan had been trained to execute since childhood, the command that turned defense into devastation. Push othismos. The rear ranks of the Greek formation drove forward with every ounce of strength they possessed. The force traveled through layers of armor and shields like a physical wave building and cresting. The front rank warriors dropped their shoulders and surged ahead as one coordinated mass. The Medes caught between spear points, stabbing from the front, and the crushing weight rolling inexorably from behind, simply shattered. The men at the very front of the Persian formation died where they stood, trampled and crushed. The men directly behind them stumbled over the corpses piling up and were trampled in turn by their own comrades pushing from the rear. The soldiers further back in the column couldn't even see what was happening ahead. All they knew was that the line in front of them had stopped moving forward, and officers were screaming and beating them to keep them pressing into the gap. Step by step, body by body, they were herded like cattle into the same narrow corridor of death. The Persian dead accumulated so fast they literally became part of the terrain. obstacles that had to be climbed over or pushed aside. The Greeks adapted and used it tactically. When the front rank began to tire visibly, arms shaking, breathing ragged, shields growing heavy, Leonidas's officers executed a maneuver they had rehearsed thousands of times in training. The phalanx line rotated smoothly. Fresh hoplites from the rear ranks stepped forward into the killing positions at the front, while exhausted fighters slipped backward to rest and recover. All of this happened without opening a single exploitable gap in the shield wall, without giving the enemy any opportunity to break through. This constant rotation kept the Greek defense operating at full strength and efficiency, while the Persian attackers had no equivalent system. They were simply driven forward in waves until they died, broke, or fled in panic. Wave after wave of Persian soldiers struck the Greek wall. Wave after wave disintegrated against it, leaving nothing but corpses. Xerxes watched from his elevated command position, waiting confidently for the moment when the Greeks would finally crack under sustained pressure, drop their shields, and flee into the mountains. That moment never came. When the Medes failed completely, Xerxes sent in fresh troops from other subject nations, different ethnic contingents, different equipment, but the same result. The pass was too narrow. Numbers meant absolutely nothing. All the Persians accomplished was adding more bodies to the growing heap, choking the ground. By the time darkness finally fell on the first day of fighting, the Persians had gained exactly nothing, not a single foot of ground. Hundreds, possibly thousands of their soldiers lay dead in and around the pass, piled in grotesque heaps. Greek casualties were minimal, some wounds, some exhaustion, but the line remained unbroken. The defenders withdrew in good order behind their rebuilt wall as night settled over the pass, not in panic or disorder, but in disciplined formations. They cleaned and bandaged wounds. They repaired cracked shields and bent armor plates. They sharpened spear points dulled from repeated impacts against bone and bronze. The machine-like discipline that had been literally beaten into them since they were 7 years old was performing exactly as Sparta had designed it to perform. Xerxes refused to accept that this was anything more than a temporary setback, a fluke of terrain and luck. On the second day of battle, he stopped feeding second-rate provincial troops into the grinder. He committed his immortals, the elite crown jewel of the Persian military. The immortals were a standing force maintained at exactly 10,000 soldiers at all times. They earned their fearsome name because their number never visibly decreased the instant one soldier fell in battle or died from disease. Another was immediately promoted from the ranks to fill the gap, maintaining the unit at its full strength perpetually. They were better equipped than ordinary Persian infantry, with scale armor and more substantial shields. They were far better trained, drilled constantly in formation fighting. They carried a reputation earned across 3 continents for grinding through any resistance with relentless, methodical, professional pressure, supported by devastating coordinated archery. They marched into the pass at Thermopylae under their own distinctive standards, radiating the confidence of men who had broken enemies from India to Egypt. They had never been stopped for long. No defensive position had held against them when they committed fully. At Thermopylae, they hit exactly the same immovable wall as everyone who came before them. The constricted terrain strangled their ability to deploy properly or use their superior numbers. Only the men at the very front of their formation could actually engage the Greeks in hand-to-hand combat. The legendary Persian archery that had devastated armies in open-field battles was nearly useless here. Arrows couldn't arc properly in the confined space, and Greek shields held overhead provided effective cover. Their wicker and scale armor offered more protection than the cloth and leather the Medes had worn. But the Greek spears were still fundamentally longer, giving the defenders a critical reach advantage. The hoplon shield still interlocked into an unbroken bronze barrier. Bronze and iron still defeated wicker and leather in close combat. The immortals pressed forward in their famous disciplined ranks, and the Greek spear points methodically found the seams and gaps in their armor and opened them. Leonidas chose this moment to execute a tactical maneuver designed to shatter Persian morale completely. At a carefully calculated point in the fighting when the immortals had committed fully, when they were pressing hard against the Greek line, he gave a prearranged signal. The Greeks executed a feigned retreat, stepping backward in perfect formation, as though the defensive line was finally collapsing under sustained pressure. The Persians, convinced that victory was finally at hand after 2 days of frustration, surged eagerly after them into the widening gap. Then, on a single shouted command that echoed across the pass, the Greek hoplites reversed direction instantly and charged forward, slamming their shields like battering rams into the rushing, disorganized attackers and driving spears through the tangled mass of bodies. The sudden reversal from apparent retreat to devastating counterattack in seconds turned the narrow road into a butcher's floor covered in blood and broken men. The immortals, trapped between the renewed Greek assault ahead and their own officers, forcing more troops forward from behind, fell in heaps. Herodotus records that Xerxes leaped up from his throne 3 separate times that day in fury and disbelief as he watched his most feared, most elite soldiers fail utterly to overwhelm a few thousand Greeks in a narrow pass. Whether that specific detail is literally, precisely true or represents dramatic embellishment doesn't change the underlying reality it captures. The King of Kings had personally committed his finest troops, soldiers who had never known defeat, and watched them bleed out, uselessly, in a space too confined for their numbers or their tactical advantages to make any meaningful difference. By nightfall of the second day, the strategic situation had not changed at all. Persian losses were catastrophic. Thousands more dead added to the piles from the first day. The Greeks were battered, exhausted, running low on food and water, but the defensive line remained completely intact. The narrow pass had transformed the largest army the world had ever assembled into a procession of victims being fed systematically, one group at a time, into a killing machine specifically designed to slaughter them. Xerxes desperately needed a way around the choke point. From the front, the Greek phalanx was doing precisely what generations of training and tactical evolution had built it to do. No frontal assault, no matter how determined or well-equipped, could break through that wall as long as the men behind those interlocked shields held their nerve and maintained discipline. Then someone stepped forward who would break the entire defensive equation without ever personally raising a weapon against a single Spartan. His name was Ephialtes, a local man from the region of Malis who knew the mountains intimately. Not a warrior of any particular renown, not a figure of political importance or military distinction, just a man who knew the terrain and saw an opportunity. He approached the Persian camp with a proposition that would change everything. In exchange for whatever reward, Xerxes offered gold, land, favor, protection, position. He would reveal a hidden mountain trail that wound up and over the ridge behind the Greek defensive position. It was an old shepherd's path known to locals, called the Thermopylae path, used for moving livestock between summer and winter pastures, barely wide enough for men to march in single file in some sections, steep and treacherous, but passable for infantry willing to climb. This was exactly the tactical breakthrough Xerxes had been desperately searching for. If he could send a strong force along that hidden trail under cover of darkness and bring them crashing down behind the Greek line at dawn, Leonidas and his defenders would be caught between two armies, Persians attacking from the front as usual, and a fresh force hitting them from behind. The phalanx, designed and drilled to face enemies from one direction with shields locked forward, would be completely helpless against a coordinated attack from the rear. Shields pointing forward couldn't stop arrows and blades coming from behind. There was no hesitation, no debate. Xerxes selected a powerful strike force and placed it under the command of Hydarnes, one of his most trusted and capable generals. Under the cover of darkness on the second night, Hydarnes led the immortals and other elite units into the mountain, moving as quietly as thousands of armored men could possibly manage, picking their way carefully through forest and rocky terrain, guided step by Ephialtes and other local collaborators who knew every twist and turn of the path. Leonidas was not naive or careless. He knew the Thermopylae path existed. Local Greeks had informed him of it during the initial defensive planning. He had positioned a force of 1,000 Phocian soldiers on the mountain route, specifically to guard it against exactly this kind of flanking maneuver. Their mission was absolutely clear. If the Persians attempted to use the mountain path to outflank the main Greek position, the Phocians were to hold the high ground, block the narrow trail, create a second choke point, and prevent any enemy force from descending behind the main defensive line. But the Phocians were not Spartans. They had not survived the Agouge. They had not been systematically brutalized from childhood to stand and die rather than retreat. They did not think the way Leonidas and his 300 had been conditioned to think. As Hydarnes and his massive column climbed steadily through the darkness, the sound of thousands of boots crunching through dry leaves and armor plates rattling against rocks traveled ahead of them through the still mountain air. The Phocians, camped on the heights, heard it clearly. They woke to the unmistakable noise of branches snapping and metal clinking somewhere in the darkness below their position. At first, they may have assumed it was a small raiding party or a scouting detachment, nothing they couldn't handle. Then the true scale of the movement became horrifyingly clear as more and more sounds echoed up from below. Not a handful of scouts, not a small diversionary force. Thousands of heavily armed Persian soldiers were climbing directly toward their position through the night. Fear and confusion spread through the Phocian ranks like wildfire. Instead of locking shields across the narrow path and forcing the Persians to fight uphill into a defensive wall of spears, exactly the kind of engagement that heavily favors defenders holding higher ground, the Phocians made a fatal decision. They pulled back to an even more elevated position further up the mountain, prioritizing their own survival and defensive security but effectively abandoning the lower sections of the trail. Hydarnes had absolutely no interest in fighting the Phocians, if he could possibly avoid it. His mission was not to defeat the Greek forces guarding the mountain. His objective was to get behind Leonidas as quickly as possible and trap the main defensive force. He left a screening detachment to keep the Phocians pinned in their elevated position, preventing them from interfering or sending warnings. Then he drove the main column forward at maximum speed along the now unguarded lower path. The trap was closing systematically around Thermopylae. Just before dawn on the third day, as the first gray light began to spread across the eastern sky, devastating news reached the Greek camp at the pass. A breathless runner arrived first. One of the sentries posted on the approaches, reporting urgently that enemy forces had been spotted moving through the hills and forests above the main defensive position. Shortly after, either a deserter from the Persian side or another Greek scout confirmed the absolute worst. The Phocian guard on the mountain path had failed to hold. Persian troops were descending rapidly behind the Greek position. Within hours, perhaps less, the defenders at Thermopylae would have Persian forces pressing in simultaneously from both front and rear. The Greek allied commanders converged on Leonidas immediately in emergency council. The defensive plan that had held brilliantly for 2 blood-soaked days was now falling apart. The tactical advantages that had allowed a few thousand to hold off hundreds of thousands were evaporating. The options that remained were few, and none of them were good by any measure. They could abandon the pass entirely and retreat south immediately, trying to preserve the army for future battles. But that meant opening the road. The entire Persian invasion force would pour through Thermopylae into central Greece with nothing to slow their advance. They could attempt to break forward through the main Persian battle line before Hydarnes arrived from the mountain, gambling everything on a desperate frontal assault. But the army in front of them was still enormous, still relatively fresh, while the Greek defenders were exhausted and low on supplies. Or they could stay and die where they stood, buying every possible hour of additional delay even though the position was now untenable. Leonidas called a formal council of the allied Greek commanders. Representatives from the different city-states argued their cases passionately. Some pushed hard for immediate withdrawal, insisting that saving the surviving soldiers to fight another day made more strategic sense than dying uselessly in a pass that could no longer be held effectively. Others argued with equal passion that every man present should stay and fight to the absolute last breath, buying as much time as humanly possible for the Greek fleet and the southern cities to prepare. Both positions had genuine strategic merit. Thermopylae was no longer a viable defensive position. It was rapidly becoming a death trap. But every hour the Persians spent grinding down a final pocket of desperate Greek resistance was an hour the Athenian-led fleet could use to maneuver at sea, an hour Athens itself could use to complete its evacuation, an hour the cities of the Peloponnese could use to strengthen fortifications and mobilize reserves. Leonidas carried the weight of the Delphic prophecy constantly in his mind. Either Sparta would be destroyed, or a Spartan king must die in battle. The oracle's words were absolute. If he retreated now, he might save his own life and the lives of his 300. He might preserve experienced soldiers who could fight in future battles. But he would surrender the pass without exhausting every possible option, and the story that would spread across Greece would be devastatingly simple. They ran when it mattered most. If he stayed, he would die. The prophecy made that certain. But every additional hour the Persians spent destroying his final defensive position would be an hour purchased with Spartan blood, time that could make the difference between Greek survival and total Persian conquest. His death would not be merely a symbolic gesture or heroic sacrifice. It would be a tactical purchase. Buying irreplaceable time with the most valuable currency, he possessed his life and the lives of his men. He made his decision with the same cold clarity that had characterized every major choice in his life. Leonidas formally ordered the majority of the allied Greek forces to withdraw from Thermopylae immediately. The bulk of the Greek army, several thousand soldiers, would leave the pass, fall back south in organized formations, and rejoin the broader defensive effort elsewhere. They were not cowards. For leaving, they had a critical mission: carry the warning south, spread the word about what was happening, rejoin the fight at the next defensive position, keep the resistance alive for the battle still to come, keep Greece itself alive. A rear guard would remain behind at Thermopylae to hold the Persians as long as humanly possible, to make Xerxes pay in blood for every foot of ground. Leonidas's 300 Spartans would form the core of that sacrificial rear guard. They had known from the moment of selection what this mission truly was. They were not the only ones who refused to leave when given the chance. 700 soldiers from the small city of Thespiae chose voluntarily to stay and die alongside the Spartans. The Thespians understood with perfect, brutal clarity that if the Persian flood rolled south, completely unchecked, their own city, located almost directly in the invasion path, would be among the very first to be consumed and destroyed. They made a conscious choice to die at Thermopylae, hoping their sacrifice might buy enough time for something, anything, to be saved. There were also roughly 400 soldiers from Thebes in the Greek camp. Their situation was fundamentally different and far more complicated. Thebes had a deeply ambiguous, suspicious relationship with Persia. Strong evidence suggested that elements of the Theban government were already preparing to collaborate, to mediate, to submit when the time came. Leonidas did not trust them at all. He held the Theban contingent at Thermopylae not as honored allies fighting for a common cause, but as hostages' insurance against the very real possibility that Theban soldiers might defect openly to the Persian side in the middle of the final stand, if given any opportunity. The rest of the Greek army began its organized march south. Some soldiers left with heavy hearts, some with shame eating at them, some with nothing but overwhelming relief at escaping certain death. Behind them, just over 1,000 men, 300 Spartans, 700 Thespian volunteers, 400 Theban hostages settled into their positions for the last time, preparing to face the full weight of an empire. Before we follow them into that final terrible morning, remember, everything you're hearing is built from actual historical sources, ancient texts, archaeological evidence, and modern scholarship analyzed carefully. The foundation comes from Herodotus, writing within living memory of these events, cross-referenced with other sources and physical evidence from the site itself. Now, back to Thermopylae. Leonidas turned to address the men who had chosen to remain, or in the Thebans' case, who had no choice. The Spartans needed no elaborate speeches to understand what was happening. They had known since the day they were selected that this mission had no return built into it. The Thespians had not been ordered to stay. They had chosen it freely with full knowledge of the cost. The Thebans understood they could not leave even if they wanted to. Leonidas had made that decision for them. As the first light of the third day began to spread pale and cold across the sky, the men still standing at Thermopylae prepared differently than they had on any previous morning of the battle. There was no plan to rotate fresh fighters into the front line. No expectation of relief forces arriving from Sparta. No hope of reinforcement. They ate whatever food remained in their packs. They inspected their weapons one final time with the care of men who knew these would be the last tools they ever used. They tightened loose armor straps. They adjusted helmets that had been dented and scraped by 2 days of brutal close combat. According to the accounts preserved by later sources, Leonidas addressed his Spartans with a brief, characteristically blunt order before the day's fighting began. It was not about achieving victory or holding until relief arrived. It was about how to die, Spartans. Fill your stomachs now. Tonight we dine in Hades. One final tactical decision remained. He could keep his dwindling force packed defensively behind the rebuilt stone wall and let the Persians come to them as they had for 2 days. Or he could do the opposite, lead a final aggressive charge beyond the protective narrows into the wider ground beyond, and inflict as much devastating damage as possible before the encircling force arrived from behind to seal the trap. Waiting behind the wall meant being slowly crushed between 2 converging armies, ground down like grain between millstones. Attacking meant dying on their feet, moving forward, choosing exactly who they would take with them into death. Leonidas chose to attack. He ordered the last defenders to move forward out from behind the protection of the wall and advance aggressively into the broader section of the pass beyond the narrowest choke point. It gave them room to maneuver, room to strike with devastating effect. It also stripped away every safety net, every fallback position. There was no second defensive line to retreat to, no reserve wall to fall back behind. This was the last ground they would ever fight on, and they would fight on it until they were all dead. Xerxes already knew from his scouts and from Hydarnes's steady progress through the mountain during the night that the Greeks were completely surrounded. He expected this final phase to be quick and relatively clean, a matter of hours at most. His main army reformed and prepared for another assault. Archers nocked arrows. Infantry formations pressed forward with renewed confidence born from the knowledge that behind the Greek position, the immortals were descending the mountainside to seal the trap shut. What Xerxes still somehow failed to grasp, even at this late stage, even after 2 full days of watching his armies bleed against Greek shields, was that Leonidas was not fighting to survive or to win in any conventional sense. He was fighting to make the cost of this Persian victory so catastrophically high, so devastating in blood and broken bodies, that Xerxes and Persia would feel it and remember it long after every last Greek defender had been killed. The fighting on that 3rd day was nothing like the controlled, mechanical defense of the previous 2 days. The Greeks still formed disciplined ranks, training that deep could not be abandoned, but they did not hold a fixed defensive position and wait for the enemy to come to them. They drove forward aggressively, again and again, smashing into the Persian lines with terrifying violence, targeting not just ordinary soldiers, but officers, standard bearers, anyone whose death would ripple confusion and panic through the enemy formation. Their long spears drove through Persian armor and flesh with brutal efficiency. When those spears finally splintered and shattered under the sustained violence of repeated impacts against shields and bone, the Greeks drew their short Xiphos swords and kept killing at even closer range, fighting in the press of bodies where skill and fury mattered more than reach. The Thespian volunteers fought with the same ferocious intensity as the Spartans. Their city lay almost directly south of Thermopylae in the invasion path. They understood, with total, terrible clarity, that if the Persians punched through this position unchecked and unopposed, Thespia would be among the first cities consumed by the advancing tide. There was no safe retreat waiting for them deep in the Peloponnese, no protected territory where their families could hide. Every second they purchased in this killing corridor was another heartbeat of time for their loved ones to flee, for something to be saved from the coming destruction. The battle dissolved into a chaotic series of savage surges back and forth. The Greeks charged forward in tight formation, cut down everything in front of them with mechanical precision, then were gradually shoved backward by the sheer crushing mass of Persian bodies pouring against them from all sides. Each time they gave ground, they made the Persians pay for every single step in blood and broken men. The road filled rapidly with the detritus of close combat shattered shields, pieces of broken armor, severed limbs, corpses heaped so thick they became obstacles. The air was choked with dust kicked up by thousands of feet, thick with the metallic smell of blood, heavy with the screams of wounded and dying men from both sides. Leonidas remained fighting in the front ranks throughout. A Spartan king did not direct battles from a position of safety far behind the lines. He fought where the killing was thickest, where the danger was greatest. Ancient sources indicate clearly that he deliberately aimed his attacks at high-ranking Persians whenever possible, trying to tear holes in the enemy's command structure and spread confusion and panic through their officer corps. He had no realistic hope of reaching Xerxes himself. The King of Kings remained carefully guarded far behind the front lines, protected by layers of elite troops. But Leonidas could still destroy the men closest to the Persian throne, the commanders and nobles who formed the backbone of Xerxes' invasion. At some point during that rolling, savage fight, the sources don't give us precise timing, Leonidas fell. Herodotus does not provide a detailed cinematic description of the killing blow. There is no dramatic final speech preserved, no perfectly composed last words. Some later traditions claim he was brought down by a concentrated hail of missiles, spears, and arrows, finding him simultaneously, as his distinctive armor and prominent position made him an obvious priority target. Other accounts record simply that he died fighting with extraordinary courage in the front line. However the fatal wound came, whatever weapon delivered it, the result was final and irreversible. The king of Sparta, son of Anaxandridas, traced his lineage back through generations to the hero Heracles himself, was killed in the front rank of battle, exactly where he had chosen to stand. What happened immediately after Leonidas fell reveals the depth of loyalty and the strength of bonds his training and leadership had forged. When their king collapsed, when the man they had followed north collapsed, bleeding into the dust, the surviving Spartans did not falter or stagger backward in shock and grief. They did not break formation. They closed ranks directly over his fallen body and transformed the next phase of the battle into a desperate, ferocious war to protect their king's corpse from desecration. Persian soldiers, seeing the Spartan king fall, surged forward with renewed energy to seize the body. For Xerxes and the Persian command, dragging Leonidas's corpse back to their lines would be the ultimate symbol of victory, proof that the stubborn Greek resistance was finally, definitively shattered. For the Spartans, allowing that to happen would be a catastrophe that went beyond military defeat into something that struck at the very core of their identity. Losing their king's body to enemy desecration would be a wound deeper and more painful than any physical injury. The Spartans and their Thespian allies formed a tight defensive ring around Leonidas's fallen body. Wave after wave of Persian troops threw themselves at that circle, trying desperately to break through the wall of shields and spears and drag the royal corpse away as a trophy. wave after wave was beaten back with horrific losses. Herodotus records specifically that the Greeks repelled 4 separate, full-scale assaults aimed at capturing Leonidas's body. During those desperate struggles, fought over the corpse of their king, 2 of Xerxes' own brothers, high-ranking Persian nobles commanding elite units, were killed, cut down in the chaos and confusion of close combat. The Greeks managed somehow to pull Leonidas's body back toward their shrinking defensive perimeter. But with every passing minute, the tactical situation grew more desperate. More Persian soldiers flooded into the pass from the front, behind the Greeks. On the mountain path, Hydarnes and his flanking force were completing their descent. The sound of their approach, thousands of feet, the clatter of equipment grew steadily louder. Arrows began raining down with increasing density from multiple directions as Persian archers found positions on the heights. The protective ring of defenders around Leonidas's body shrank steadily, contracting as more men fell and the dead piled higher inside the circle. Gradually, step by bloody step, the surviving defenders pulled back to a small hillock near the rear of the pass, a low mound of earth that ancient sources identify as the site of their final stand. There, with Persians closing in from literally every direction, with Hydarnes's force now fully in position behind them, with escape impossible and death absolutely certain, the remaining Greeks gathered whatever strength they still possessed. Their spears were gone, broken in the fighting, or lost. Many shields had been smashed apart. Armor hung in shredded pieces from their bodies. Blood covered everything. But they still would not surrender. They still would not kneel. On that small rise of earth, they fought with whatever remained. Short swords thrust and slashed. Daggers stabbed. When blades broke or were knocked from hands, they used stones pulled from the ground, smashing them into Persian faces and skulls. When even stones were gone, they fought with bare fists, with teeth, with anything. This was no longer the precision fighting machine of the first day's disciplined phalanx. This was raw, animal survival driven by fury and duty, and the absolute knowledge that every second of continued resistance still mattered, still meant something beyond that blood-soaked hill. Xerxes watched from his command position. He had fed thousands upon thousands of soldiers into Thermopylae over 3 days. He had committed his most elite units. He had watched his best warriors beaten back repeatedly by a defensive force that should have been annihilated in the first hour of fighting. Now, finally, with his enemies packed together on a tiny mound and surrounded completely on every side, he made the tactical choice that would cost him the fewest additional Persian lives. He ordered the archers forward en masse. Thousands of Persian bowmen formed their ranks at optimal range. They drew their bows in coordinated volleys. They released. Arrow after arrow, volley after volley struck the cluster of Greek bodies on the hill. There was nowhere to hide, no cover remaining, no shields left intact to raise overhead, no strength remaining for any final desperate charge. The sky filled with shafts so many that the air itself seemed to darken. Herodotus records that earlier in the battle, a local Greek had warned the defenders that the Persian archers were so numerous their volleys would literally block out the sun. A Spartan warrior, his name lost to history, had reportedly answered with perfect laconic brevity, "Good. Then we shall fight in the shade." On that final hill, with arrows falling like rain, there was nothing left of defiance but its echo. The volleys continued. When the archery finally stopped and Persian soldiers cautiously approached the mound to confirm what everyone already knew, they found it carpeted with the dead. The last Spartans died there. The Thespian volunteers who had chosen to stay died beside them. Many of the Thebans died as well, though some Thebans may have thrown down their weapons at the very end and attempted to surrender. Herodotus suggests the Persians treated surrendering Thebans differently from the others, viewing them as unreliable enemies and probable future collaborators, rather than true committed rebels, branding some of them as slaves. Thermopylae belonged to Xerxes. The pass was open. The road south into the heart of Greece lay before him undefended, and he had paid for it with a butcher's bill that staggered even the commanders of the largest army ever assembled. Ancient sources cite figures as high as 20,000 Persian dead over 3 days of fighting. Even if that number represents exaggeration or propaganda, even if the true casualties were half that, the losses were absolutely devastating. For a narrow strip of coastal rock, for a delay of just 3 days, for a battle that ended in complete tactical defeat, the King of Kings had spent tens of thousands of lives. The victorious Persian soldiers walked the battlefield in the aftermath. They stripped usable armor and weapons from the fallen. They sorted Greek dead from Persian casualties. They began the grim work of dealing with thousands of corpses in summer heat. The Thebans who had survived by surrendering were not rewarded for their compliance or treated as valuable allies. They were branded literally, with hot irons burning royal Persian symbols into their skin, marking them as property, as owned men. It was a living testament that surrendering to Xerxes did not guarantee dignity or freedom, only a different kind of humiliation. Then Xerxes began searching for one body in particular among all the dead Leonidas. They found him somewhere in the heaps of corpses, his body torn and pierced by multiple wounds like every other fallen warrior on that blood-soaked field. At this critical moment, Xerxes faced a choice that would define how this victory would be remembered. In traditional Greek warfare, even bitter enemies customarily respected the bodies of fallen commanders once the fighting ended. Returning a corpse for proper burial was considered a basic act of decency and honor that civilized peoples owed each other. There was a widely held religious belief across the ancient world that the dead belonged to the gods, and that mutilating a body invited divine punishment and cosmic retribution. Xerxes, consumed by 3 days of rage and humiliation, chose fury over custom and tradition. In a decision that revealed more about his state of mind than any official proclamation, he ordered Leonidas's body decapitated. The severed head was mounted on a wooden stake and raised high for the entire Persian army to see, a deliberate act of desecration designed to erase the dignity of the Spartan king and break Greek morale. The rest of the corpse was reportedly displayed or further mutilated. If Xerxes' goal was to demonstrate Persian dominance and terrorize the Greeks into submission, the act achieved the exact opposite effect. The story that swept south through Greece was not that Leonidas had been defeated and dishonored in death. The story was that Leonidas had fought until his very last breath, had terrified the King of Kings so deeply that Xerxes felt compelled to mutilate a dead man's body just to convince himself he had truly won. To Greek ears, that act of desecration revealed not Persian strength or confidence, but Persian fear and insecurity. A king secure in his power does not need to defile corpses. The soldiers who had left Thermopylae when Leonidas ordered the general withdrawal carried the full story south to the other Greek cities. They did not describe a simple, straightforward military defeat. They described how a tiny force had faced the full crushing weight of the Persian Empire, had held it in place for 3 full days against impossible odds, and had died to the last man to purchase time for everything that came after. They told of the prophecy delivered at Delphi, of a king who marched into a narrow pass, already knowing that a god had decreed either he or his entire city must fall. They spoke of the Thespian volunteers who chose freely to stay and die beside men who were not even their countrymen, bound only by common cause. They described how the Spartans had fought over their fallen king's body with such ferocity that they killed Persian royalty in the desperate struggle. And they mentioned with revulsion and anger how Xerxes had severed Leonidas's head and abused the remains like a barbarian. Thermopylae stopped being merely a lost battle, a tactical defeat. It became a story of deliberate, conscious sacrifice, a tale of men who chose death over retreat, who bought time with their lives, who proved that courage and discipline could hold back an empire even if only temporarily. From a purely strategic military perspective, Thermopylae did not stop the Persian invasion. The pass fell. After forcing the gap at terrible cost, Xerxes' vast army swept south. Boeotia fell to Persian control. The road to Athens lay open and undefended, but those 3 days were not wasted. Leonidas had accomplished precisely what Themistocles' broader defensive strategy required. He had delayed the Persian advance long enough for the Greek fleet to reach full readiness, for cities across Greece to stop debating and start committing forces, for civilian populations in the invasion path to evacuate. Athens knew the storm was coming directly toward them. Themistocles had already persuaded his city years earlier to pour the profits from their silver mines into building a powerful fleet of warships, triremes, the fastest and most lethal vessels in the Mediterranean. Sleek ships with bronze rams designed to punch through enemy hulls. Now those Athenian ships, reinforced by contingents from other Greek states, formed the backbone of the combined Greek navy, while Xerxes advanced slowly by land, still dealing with the logistical nightmare of moving hundreds of thousands of soldiers through hostile territory. Themistocles maneuvered skillfully at sea. He used his knowledge of local waters, his understanding of Greek superiority in close quarters naval combat, to lure the vastly larger Persian fleet into confined waters where numerical superiority became a fatal liability rather than an overwhelming advantage. Exactly the same principle Leonidas had applied on land at Thermopylae. In late September 480 BC, the decisive naval engagement shifted from the mountain pass to the narrow straits near the island of Salamis. There, squeezed into a channel between the Greek mainland coastline and the island, unable to maneuver properly or bring their superior numbers to bear effectively, the Greek fleet used its intimate knowledge of local currents, its heavier construction, its bronze rams, and its tight, disciplined formations to systematically tear the Persian navy apart. Ship after ship was rammed, punctured below the waterline, capsized, or driven onto shore where it broke apart. Persian crews who had expected easy victory drowned in waters where their overwhelming numerical advantage should have guaranteed triumph. Xerxes watched this second disaster unfold from a throne set up on shore, just as he had watched the catastrophe at Thermopylae. His supply lines, dependent on naval transport, were now critically exposed and vulnerable. An army numbering in the hundreds of thousands could not sustain itself indefinitely off hostile Greek land. Without a functioning fleet to transport grain, fresh water, and reinforcements across the Aegean, his invasion was no longer a triumph in progress. It was a logistical crisis, spiraling toward potential catastrophe. In mounting alarm, weighing his options carefully, Xerxes made a fateful decision. He would personally withdraw, taking the bulk of his forces back to Asia, where they would be secure. He would leave a powerful but significantly reduced army under his most capable general, Mardonius, to complete the conquest of Greece during the following campaign season. He calculated that even a smaller Persian force, composed of veteran soldiers and supported by Greek collaborators and traitors, could eventually overwhelm the remaining resistance. After all, he still commanded tens of thousands of elite troops drawn from across his empire, and he had willing allies among Greek cities ready to open their gates. The war did not end with Xerxes' departure. The threat remained deadly. In 479 BC, Mardonius attempted to force a decisive final engagement near Plataea in Boeotia, choosing his ground carefully. This time, Sparta came with its full military strength, the complete army that religious law had prevented from marching to Thermopylae the year before. Under the command of Pausanias, serving as regent for Leonidas's young son, Pleistarchus, the Spartan-led coalition stood alongside Athenian forces and allied contingents from across Greece. The Battle of Plataea was chaotic, confused, marked by near disasters and critical moments where the entire Greek line almost disintegrated under pressure. Coordination between different city-state contingents nearly broke down completely several times. But when the day's brutal fighting finally ended, when the dust settled and the casualties were counted, the Greek hoplites had destroyed the Persian heavy infantry in close combat. Mardonius himself was killed in the fighting. The last significant Persian land force operating on Greek soil was comprehensively broken and scattered. On roughly the same day, ancient sources are unclear about exact chronology, but place the events very close together. Greek naval forces won another crushing victory at Cape Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, annihilating what remained of Persian sea power in the region. Together, these twin victories at Plataea and Mycale ended Xerxes' dream of conquering Greece permanently. The Persian Empire would remain a dominant, threatening force in the wider eastern Mediterranean region for generations to come. But the specific ambition of absorbing the Greek city-states into the Persian provincial system died in those fields and on those waters. The thread connecting Thermopylae to final Greek victory at Plataea is not a clean, straight line of inevitable causation. There were countless decisions, betrayals, accidents of weather and timing, and individual acts of courage and cowardice along the way. But without Leonidas's stand, without those 3 days purchased with Spartan and Thespian blood, the entire strategic shape of the Persian War would have been fundamentally different. Without the delay in the north, without the blazing example of resistance to rally around and draw inspiration from, many wavering Greek cities might have chosen submission over the uncertainty of resistance. The fleet might not have been fully assembled in time to fight at Salamis. The fragile alliance of rival city-states might have splintered under its own fear and mutual suspicion before ever reaching a battlefield. Leonidas was not a hero by any modern moral standard. He was an integral part of a system built on slavery, on organized terror against the Helot population, on systematic cruelty presented as education. He grew up inside a culture that trained children to hunt, and murder helots in the darkness, that used deliberate starvation and public flogging as standard teaching methods, that treated any sign of human vulnerability or compassion with absolute contempt. Even in his final stand at Thermopylae, he made ruthlessly cold calculations. He handpicked 300 men specifically to die, not to win. He held Theban soldiers as hostages against their will. He walked knowingly into the pass after a prophecy had explicitly demanded his death, and he obeyed that divine command without a moment's visible hesitation. He was, in every measurable way, the perfect product of the agoge, a man systematically stripped of softness, engineered to absorb pain without complaint, trained to follow the most brutal orders without question, willing to sacrifice everyone around him and ultimately himself for the survival of the Spartan state. And that is precisely what makes Thermopylae so dark, so morally complex, and so impossible to look away from even across 25 centuries. Sparta created something monstrous through its educational system. A human being stripped of normal emotional responses, rebuilt as a weapon, trained to value the collective above everything, including his own survival, willing to make calculations that would horrify any society that valued individual human life. And yet, when the critical moment arrived that Greece desperately needed something unbreakable standing between civilization and annihilation, that carefully crafted monster did exactly what decades of brutal conditioning had built him to do. He stood. He held. He died. Sparta's traditional instruction to its departing warriors was stark and uncompromising: with your shield, or on it. Come home victorious carrying your shield, or be carried home dead upon it as a funeral bier. Dropping your shield to run faster meant you had abandoned your honor, your place among your people, your right to be called Spartan. It was considered a fate genuinely worse than death. Leonidas fulfilled neither version of that instruction. His body never returned to Sparta in any form. Xerxes severed his head, desecrated the corpse, displayed the remains as a warning, but in a way no Spartan lawgiver could have anticipated or planned for. Leonidas transcended that ancient instruction entirely. He did not bring his shield home in triumph. He was not carried ceremonially upon it. Instead, his story became the shield not just for Sparta, but for the entire concept that a small, fractured, outnumbered people could stand against the most powerful empire on earth and refuse to disappear into subjugation. Herodotus, writing his histories within living memory of the Persian Wars, recorded the events at Thermopylae based on eyewitness accounts and careful research. Later generations of Greeks traveled to the site as pilgrims and erected monuments to honor the fallen. One of the most famous inscriptions, placed near the mound where the last defenders fell, spoke directly to anyone who passed, stranger. Go tell the Spartans that we lie here, obedient to their commands. That word obedient cuts through all the romantic mythology that later centuries draped over this story. Leonidas and his 300 did not die as free individuals acting on personal moral conviction. They died following the laws and rigid training of their city, shaped from childhood by a system that demanded total sacrifice and offered almost nothing resembling comfort, kindness, or individual recognition in return. That same obedience, that same systematic brutalization, nearly destroyed them as children. It broke some of them completely. but it also forged survivors into men who could look at the largest army their world had ever assembled and refuse to take a single step backward. Xerxes commanded perhaps 200,000 soldiers, maybe more. He had gold, warships, cavalry, siege engineers, and an empire spanning from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea. He held the title King of Kings. In every material, quantifiable sense, he possessed overwhelming force. Leonidas had a narrow pass. 7,000 men for 2 days. 1,000 for one more. A prophecy promising his death. No realistic path to military victory. But he controlled the one thing Xerxes never truly grasped: the narrative, the story, the meaning. By choosing to stand in that specific place, by choosing to die where allies and enemies alike would witness and remember, Leonidas transformed Thermopylae from a tactical defeat into an eternal symbol, a line drawn across history itself, a warning and a promise that would echo through every century that followed. The strategic military situation barely changed. Greece still faced invasion. Athens still burned. But the psychological landscape transformed completely and permanently. Centuries passed. Empires rose and fell. The Persian Empire that Xerxes commanded vanished into history long ago. Yet people across the world still know the name of a narrow, rocky coastal pass in Greece. And they know the name of the Spartan king who chose to die there rather than step aside. Xerxes tried to erase his enemy's memory and honor by mutilating a corpse. Instead, he carved Leonidas deeper into human consciousness than any monument of marble or bronze ever could. If this story changed how you see ancient history, subscribe to Maproom Battles. Comment, what's the line you won't cross? Thanks for walking this entire dark path with us. Remember, monsters can save civilizations, but the price is always paid in full.